So let's move to the terrorism now, looking at this different systems of radiological terrorism. So the radioactive poisoning is actually being used, and one of the most famous cases is certainly Alexander Litvinenko. Maybe you don't remember, but he was a Russian spy, and in 2006 he was poisoned with polonium-210, which is an alpha emitter with the half-life of 138 days, an activity of 166 terabecquerel per gram, which is huge. And for every alpha particle, the average dose is 0.5 microsievert. So you have 0.5 microsievert per becquerel by ingestion, which is what happened because this was dissolved in a coffee, which means that 50 nanograms are enough to give a lethal dose of 4.5 sievert. Really unbelievable. For comparison, you see uranium-238 is 12 kilobecquerel per gram, and the famous plutonium-239, considered the most lethal element on Earth, is only 3 gigabecquerel per gram. So it's still 5 order of magnitude below polonium. Litvinenko was killed by hepatopoietic syndrome in less than a month from the exposure to the polonium. Why he was killed by polonium is a different story, but he was. So it's certainly a very toxic substance. By mass is 250,000 more toxic than cyanide. But of course, it's very difficult to isolate. It's very difficult to isolate. So the possibility to have a serious poisoning with this kind of elements is extremely difficult. The attack to a nuclear power plant is also extremely unlikely because the attack on the reactor itself is almost impossible, and water contamination, even using materials more common than polonium, can be like plutonium, for example, remain very unlikely because the reservoir in large cities is on the order of 10 to 9 cubic meters, and the solubility of the radioactive elements is generally very small, like 0.01%. So even if you use 1 kilogram of plutonium, the concentration will be only 10 to minus 14 grams per liter, so no effects are foreseen. Even if you go to a small city, this remains unlikely. So the most likely radiological device is the radiological terrorism attack, is the dirty bombs, or also called RDD, radiological dispersed device. These are essentially very simple. The idea is simply that you have a radioactive material, and then you blast this radioactive material, and you create a cloud of radioactive material that can be taken by ingestion or by contact in the exposed people. This has never been used, so there has never really a case of radiological dispersion device used, with the one exception of the 1999, so it's even before the 9/11 in United States. This was the Chechen group, secessionist group from Russia. They wanted to use a bomb which was essentially cobalt-60 in a gas tank, but they found it. It was hidden near a railway line, so the idea was to blast it when there was many people taking the train in Argan, and the Chechen group was very ruthless. Shamil Basayev, that you see in this picture, was the head, and he was killed in one of the most horrible terrorist attacks in history to a kindergarten that was done a few years later. Other attempts are a little bit funny. Let's say, you see, in June 2002, there was a US citizen with links to Al-Qaeda arrested in Chicago airport on suspicion to planning to build and detonate a dirty bomb. He had all the information to build a dirty bomb. There are other cases like this one, you know, another. The British intelligence concluded Al-Qaeda has succeeded in constructing a dirty bomb, but the device has never been found and never used. And one of the funny stories in London in 2004, you know, the smoke alarms always have a radioactive source. It's americium in general, americium-241. Because the idea is that the emission of alpha particles from americium close the circuit, so you see the light, but when there is a smoke, americium is stopped, because, you know, americium is easily stopped, and then when the circuit is interrupted, the alarm sounds. Now, this guy, Durante Barot, tried to extract this americium from the smoke alarms, but you need enormous quantity to do a dirty bomb. So he was buying, you know, thousands of smoke alarms, and sure enough, the police found it. What happens if you explode it? Is it really dangerous or not? Well, I show you a simulation that we did a few years ago. That's after the 9/11. You know, this kind of research boosted, but still very, very important. To do this work, we used software called Hotspot that simulates the plumes, because of course it's all about the simulation of the plume, of the smoke coming from there. The Gaussian plume, the model which is used is the so-called Gaussian plume. You see it here. This is a real one, and this is the simulation of the plume, of how you dispersed it. You have to take into account the wind, of course, and the so-called Pascal atmospheric stability conditions that go from very unstable A to stable F. This gives you the pressure, the gradient pressure. We made a simulation of a radiological dispersal device done with 1 kilogram of plutonium. So the explosion of 1 kilogram of plutonium. For acute effects, you see that they are very unlikely. You see the acute doses, even in the worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is a scenario where you have a wind of about 1 meter per second and the stability class F. So in this case, the wind is not too strong, but not zero, that will keep the plume inside. The same is for the stability class, is not such that it goes too high, let's say, but this kind of remains kind of low, so it can be dispersed. For stochastic effects, you see, this is now this is ground zero, and the wind goes in this direction. So of course, everything is moving in this direction. Stability class F, you see that this is the region. These are 8 kilometers, these are 10 kilometers from the explosion, where the dose absorbed here will be 1 centisievert, 5 centisievert, 10 centisievert. Now, depending on the density of population, here we assumed a dense city with 2 million inhabitants, something, a very dense city. And then this will be the people exposed. And the estimate, you see, in total, you will have some 76,000 people exposed. The collective dose in person sievert on 1,500 sievert. And the estimates, then, if you apply simply the factor from ICRP that eventually come from Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the total cancer mortality, you come out with 80 cancers in 20 years. Of course, 80 cancers in 20 years in a population of 76,486, where you expect that some 30% of these people will actually die of the cancer, will be completely impossible to detect. So the result will be zero in any case. So the point of a radiological dispersal device, clearly from this simulation, you see, is not killing people. It's almost impossible to kill many people with the radiological dispersal device, neither by acute effect, apart from the bomb itself, from the chemicals in the bombs itself, but that you don't need a radiological dispersal device. But it's more the panic, the concern that you can generate. How is it in comparison to biological and chemical weapons? I imagine that you have to decide which kind of weapons you have to use. For the biological weapons, I cannot stress enough that in principle, they are by far the most powerful and effective. We have seen it in the Olympic Games of the most lethal events. But practically, the story is completely different. These are Class A weapons that are classified in different classes. The Class A weapons include some known agents. Some are virus, like variola major virus that induce smallpox, or the famous filoviride or arenaviride RNA viruses that include very deadly viruses like Ebola, famous Ebola. So the disease is the hemorrhagic fever. These are different. These are difficult to treat. I mean, Ebola, there is not yet an effective vaccine, but they are very difficult to grow and spread, you know. And so, Aum Shinrikyo, that we will see, is the only terrorist group so far that did an act of ultra-terrorism. They tried to get it, but were never able to use it. Even they went to Africa for that. And for variola, the smallpox, then eventually, this is a bad disease, as you know. I mean, the fatality is in the order of 30% for the ordinary case, but up to 100% for the hemorrhagic. The vaccination is possible. The vaccine was discovered. It was one of the major success of the vaccine, the eradication of the smallpox. So when the idea of using smallpox as a biological weapon started to grow, United States and other countries restarted to produce some vaccine, because of course, to be sure that in case of an attack, you are ready. Was actually used by the British in the French-Indian War in the 18th century. They gave contaminated blankets to the Indians, but with a relatively low success. Then there are many others based on bacteria, like anthrax, that was actually after the 9/11, there was a case of attack with the anthrax in the envelopes. And of course, you have botulism, again, tried to use by Aum Shinrikyo. The plague itself, that is, we have seen the most lethal agent in the history of the mankind, but it is sensitive to antibiotics now, fortunately, and is also very difficult to grow and spread. This was also used again in the Japan-China war. The Japanese used infected fleas they had these fleas that had the plague, the Yersinia pestis, and they send it to the Chinese. This is not so easy. It's called entomological warfare. I mean, there is even a category, but it's not so easy, because the flea can also go back and infect the same people that send it. And also tularemia, the rabbit fever, which is produced by the Francisella tularensis, is the disease that is transmitted by tick bites. If you go in the woods, you should worry about the tick bites because of this one. This is probably one of the easiest, but it can be cured, of course. Was allegedly used by Russians against Germans in Stalingrad, but in reality, it was only an epidemic of tularemia in the German soldiers caused by tick bites. And then was really designed for use in bomblets, the M143 and E120 built by the Russians in the 60s. So this was one of the few that was actually considered already in a weapon. But as you see, because of the technical problems at the moment. You see, the terrorist organization generally do not have class A, class B, the molecular biology lab, so it's not easy for them to use a biological weapon. Even though, as I said, I mean, this slide was before COVID-19 to convince the students. I don't think I need to convince you. In the literature, most of the Holocaust of the mankind are correctly attributed to viruses, you know, that are difficult to cure. These are movies and books that describe this kind of events. Chemical weapons instead have been used many times, actually. In World War I, until World War I, they were used, and then they were banned by all international conventions because they were so horrible. And even during World War II, where everybody was doing the most horrible things, they were not used. There were five types of chemical weapons. They are divided in nervine, blistering, asphyxiating, blood toxic, and incapacitant gases. Some of them, you see, are relatively easy to. This is the sarin gas, which is a nervine gas, so it's affecting the nervous system. While this is mustard, which is blistering, is causing the burns, horrible burns on the skin. And the blood toxic, like a prussic acid, this is the one that were used in the gas chambers in the concentration camps. It's going back and forth. You see, it was banned, but occasionally you know that was used. And the most recent example was in the Syrian war, unfortunately. The Syrian government and the rebel force have accused each other of using chemical weapons, and for sure there is a clear evidence that they were used. And this is only a few years ago now, 2013. So they are around. An example of how devastating they can be, also for large population, let's see, was an accident in 1984 in the so-called Bhopal disaster. That is an accident at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in India, and this was an accident due to the overload of tanks and lack of safety systems that led to methyl isocyanate leak. This gives very severe effects, and eventually something like 3,700 people died within a few days, plus over 10,000 for exposure relief disease in many years. So it was actually quite an example of how, let's say, the spread was very substantial, the spread of the gases, and how this chemical can also affect large fraction of populations. So actually, the Om Shri Kyo, in this movie, you see.
Weer wat later, een terroristische aanslag gehad van Om Shri Kyo sector in Tokio. En die heeft dus het saringas gebruikt in de metro. Hoe zag dat eruit? Die mannen die hadden dat meegenomen in plastic zakken, die ze vervolgens met de punt van de paraplu kapot hebben gekregen. Weet iemand daar iets van? De constructie daarvan klaar liggen op een andere manier. Oké. Nee, het is een zenuwblokkerend strijdmiddel, een saringas. Het is een zeer vluchtig chemisch strijdmiddel. En dat past dus de zenuw aan van de mensen redelijk snel dodelijk. Als je één druppel op je huid zou krijgen, dan is het wel dodelijk.
So, this is a strange story. You have realized Japan, which is the safest country in the world, is the only country that actually suffered the ultra-terrorism attack. This was done by this doomsday cult called Om Shri Kyo. The leader was this guy, Yoko Shinohara, that has been recently, a few years ago, I think only a couple of years ago, he has been actually killed. I mean, he received death penalty, but he was executed after many years. The problem of the doomsday cults is that they generally predict the doomsday, and if the doomsday is not coming, they try to accelerate the doomsday. That's what happened with Aum Shinrikyo, which is actually a Buddhist, originally is a Buddhist cult. So it's not an Islamic cult, and is not the Christian cult that you can imagine, you know, that extremist Islamic, I don't need to tell you what they do, but even extremist Christian can be very violent. They used to be very violent in South America during the time of the slaughter of the local Indians, but also, you know, like you have Christian violence, you know, also for, you know, against abortion. Nobody would really expect a Buddhist being violent, but Aum Shinrikyo was actually organized as a to produce a massacre. They tried first in Matsumoto City and then in Tokyo subway. The attack in the Tokyo subway, you have seen how it was done. There were bags containing the sarin in liquid form, and then they make a hole with the tip of an umbrella, and they release the gas. The result was less fatal than one could expect, only 11 deaths, but 505,000 wounded with very severe wounded, because the nerve gas can leave very serious sequelae. And this was really the first ultra-terrorist action, but the gas was only 30% pure. The reason is that in the Matsumoto City attack, where they wanted to kill some judges that were making investigations on the cult, as every cult, they were trying to get money from the people in the cult, and then there had been some reports to the police from the parents of the young people saying that they were stealing money. I mean, I'm sure you are familiar with how a cult works. And they were trying to kill, but the gas was too pure, and the wind went in the wrong direction and almost killed the terrorists themselves. So they decided to do the second attack with the less pure gas. So if you look now at the study of the experts, let's say like the Harvard Kennedy School, that is a center for nuclear terrorism, you see if you look at the nuclear weapons here, you know, the terrorist groups that have demonstrated interest in acquiring nuclear weapons, you see there are Al-Qaeda, Chechnya-based separatists, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Aum Shinrikyo. Aum Shinrikyo is always everywhere. You know, they were very, very active. But in reality, you see there are no known cases where terrorists really acquired fissile material. Of course, could terrorists steal or buy this material? The answer is yes. Enriched uranium or plutonium. So, of course, in 2020 now there is far less discussion on terrorism, because most of the major terrorist organizations in the beginning of the 21 of the 21st century are in disarray. Al-Qaeda disappeared essentially a few years ago, but even ISIS, that was really powerful only with their own state until 3 or 4 years ago, now have been defeated. This does not mean that it's not conceivable to have a terrorist attack, because there are other groups that are maybe new groups like Boko Haram, which is active mostly in Africa, that they are even, if possible, even more ruthless and potentially dangerous than ISIS or Al-Qaeda. There is something also a bit scary about the use of nuclear weapons. If you read this document, which is not classified, so it's a document that you can read, I can also give it to you if you want, is a document on nuclear operations from the Department of Defense in US, dated June 2019, so it's only 1 year ago. They claim that the nuclear tactical war is more likely now than during the Cold War. So somehow the fact that there is not anymore the Cold War, you know, kept the peace for many, many years after the Second World War, in a period where it was considered obvious that there was going to be a war between the democracy in the West and the communists in the East. This never happened, and somehow retrospectively we can say this never happened thanks to the Cold War, thanks to the nuclear weapons. There was an equilibrium that scared everybody, stopped everybody, and prevented any war. But now that there's not any more Cold War, it becomes more likely what is called a nuclear tactical war. So the use of nuclear weapons in a small scenario, not in a global war, you know, where you really want to destroy Russia or vice versa, you want to destroy Europe or United States, but where you fight, for example, against North Korea. So if North Korea does something, you can consider a retaliation, dropping tactical nuclear weapons. This is scary, of course, but again, this means that the knowledge of this in this lecture, I think, should be carefully considered. These are my conclusions that are, of course, personal on the side of the terrorism, because that's a topic where it's not only science is important, but also psychology. Most experts think that the ultra-terrorists are very likely and to a certain extent unavoidable, which, however, I have to tell you, this statement, the same slide, I show this same slide since more than 10 years. And we have not seen it. After Aum Shinrikyo, which is in the 20th century, we have never seen ultra-terrorist attack in the 21st century. We have seen instead, actually, that the terrorist attacks are decreasing in technological skills. So compared to the 9/11, for example, where we had, in any case, hijacking of Boeing, of four Boeing 747. I mean, it was a very ambitious plan. Now the technology is going down and down. Most of the most recent attacks by terrorists were done either by trucks, hitting people by trucks, which is very low technology, but relatively effective in terms of casualties and in terms of panic. And of course, even now with knives, which is really not so effective, let's say, but still good to create panic. If they want to use ultra-terrorism, I think that the Aum Shinrikyo experience shows that the easiness and reliability of the weapon is the utmost important parameter. A-bombs, for sure, the most devastating and appealing for a terrorist group, because any terrorist group with an atomic bomb will have an enormous power of negotiation, but they are really difficult to build, steal, or use. Certainly, highly organized terrorist group may consider the goal of primary vital importance to the point that it may require coups, and this has been is always something frightening. If you take the Taliban, for example, could take power in Pakistan and then gain control over their atomic bombs, because Pakistan is a nuclear power. The radiological dispersion device is very easy to build, but the actual damage is very limited. So if we talk about in terms of damage and mass casualties, the radiological devices are always down here. The biological device in principle are first, but it's so difficult to build them that probably they are less than chemicals. However, for the psychological impact, radiological device together with biological device, if you want to jump to the first position, because radiation is always a scare, is the radiophobia effect. So the correct scientific information on radiation effects may help preventing uncontrolled panicking following radiological attacks, which ultimately is the real success for a terrorist organization. Thank you.